fingers are so bad.
Can you tell us when you start that thing?
It's on right now.
I wish I had fingers like yours. Hers are so like nice. I have better fingers. Mine are like kind of really off. My hands are so strong. I'm sure when we have our power flowing with like help.
There's a plug by your right leg underneath.
I'll put my water bottle in my backpack.
Yes, those are on. Thank you. Well, thank you. That's good. Scholars, you were awesome a week ago. You're going to be awesome today. Evidence, it's a conversation. We're talking about things that matter. We're just being awesome. Proud of you. I'm going to be able to see it after the fact, but during the course of, just need to be doing other stuff.
Watching film.
Watching film for our next event, yeah. Be fantastic today. Support each other. All of you who are out there, the degree to which you're paying attention here matters, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Knocking dead, guys. Proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peck.
Your timer is going to be junior again. Do you want them here or there?
There. Next to the trash.
Working on it.
Thank you. Morgan, be careful what you said.
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna say anything. I'm just like it's frozen.
Oh, I want
It's okay.
Okay.
Statue of Jefferson's like right next to the table.
Just rub his head for some good luck.
That might be it.
Give him a little kiss.
Yeah, everyone has to concentrate.
Yeah, like, we don't
No, dude, don't worry. I'm actually like.
Speaking our words.
No, I got it. Do you need anything?
Don't be shy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, April's too. April's the other end.
It's George Mason. The black sprite.
Emily, you have to share
Never had a season.
after the
You gotta have scissors. Like I've had like a lot of other Wawa stuff.
Not the star drive, like, man, yeah.
The citizen. Yeah, if it's like, make sure.
Yeah, well, that's just not. I mean, it should. It should.
Like in our group.
The judges will get a 5-year. That is so judges.
You just gotta make sure you're doing that you're really good.
They're gonna do something. there's no. Wait, there's so. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm the one.
Oh, me
Wow.
too. Single members of working
Is
stuff.
that my mom?
And that's just like choose part of it that.
The camera.
He's of course. Yeah.
You can probably just click it.
Usually don't have an agenda though. I don't feel bad. I knew it. Yes, Mom, you got it. I think we're all competent.
Reading my email. My Guys, this is the time when someone's supposed to be outside of the class telling.
There's a zone there.
For every college attendance. Depending on how many you apply. Y'all are going to the library. Oh, yeah. Do we have someone out there? There's a sign.
Yeah.
This is I feel like you're not.
I'm not a competitive mood.
Aubrey, April, breathe,
Yeah?
breathe, oxygen.
Oh, yes. Go in the library. Yeah, you just leave that on your poster out. Say hi to the live stream. Thank you. Not yet. So cute. I want to be friends with her. She seems like a soft one. No, I was worried, like, why? You're in the library. It's so funny. People watching the live stream right now. They walk in and see them. We're so glad you're fine. I'm supposed to be here. I was not prepared. Okay. Your hair is up and cute. I was just gonna say that. Your RG knows. How's it been going?
You guys are sharp as usual.
Thank you.
Library.
Lola.
Hi Lola, I'm Riley.
Hi.
You're so enthusiastic about music festival. Love it.
Well, I'm kind of You're timing again. I'm like, right, awesome.
So ready for next year?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You've seen the
What?
Also-
The president is our
Article
executive
one.
branch.
Oh no.
Article
wait.
2, clause.
Yeah, you're on a live.
Oh, and. Stuff? Oh, no, it's just, okay, alright, we're good.
Oh, you got an official software.
What's up, guys? I'm back.
What I've been thinking is remote.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Honestly, as long as it's on. It's alright. We don't say like the hard
Okay, I'll go to 19. Yeah.
Morning. Got me seated. Thank you. My name is Justin Smith. I'll be one of your judges this morning. I work for Medicaid. I work kind of like a translator, translate the IT for the legal guys and legal for the IT guys. And then with me,
Steve Blank, I'm the Director of Education and Visitor Programs at Monticello.
Patrick Campbell, I was an attorney for the Marine Corps, and now I'm at James Madison's Montpelier.
Good morning. We are Team Marshall from Douglas Freeman High School. My name is April Miller.
My name is Aubrey Walker.
I'm Cindy Shea.
I'm Riley Spido.
And our teacher, Mr. Peck, is unfortunately not with us today. We are looking forward to having a conversation with you.
all right. So the American colonies experienced 150 years of self-government prior to independence. What did the colonists learn about the proper role of government from their experiences? What were the British influences, if any, on American constitutionalism? And why did American colonists want to free themselves from Great Britain?
The legacy of British constitutionalism can be found throughout American government. From the Magna Carta, we established rule of law and limited government. From the Habeas Corpus Act, we emphasized due process, as seen in Amendments 5, 6, 7, and 8. From the English Bill of Rights and Petition of Right, we emphasized individual rights, much like the Bill of Rights, which emphasized individual liberties. From the Triennial Act, we established that the role of representative government is to address and protect the rights of the people. When these ideals transferred to the new British colonies, colonial charters and new state constitutions echoed them. The Mayflower Compact initiated self-governance in the American colonies, with a focus on rule of law and consent of the governed. The Connecticut Charter highlighted self-governance again, this time a representative body with the powers to tax, reminiscent of British precedent. The Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter took steps towards becoming a democratic republic, a precursor to the ideals set forth by Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws.
Despite smooth sailing for 150 years of salutary neglect, trouble in the colonies began when the British government began consistently violating their liberties. From the Declaration of Independence, these violations were referred to as a long train of abuses, including the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts. There were other examples of organized resistance. In fact, when Massachusetts citizens refused to obey the Navigation Acts, their colony charter was revoked. These various acts emphasized British control over the colonies and violated American rights by ignoring British precedent like rule of law, consent of the governed, and limited government. These principles had been applied to the colonists through colonial charters like the Virginia Colony Charter, which granted the rights of Englishmen to all those born in the colonies. and yet they were clearly violated by the British government. For example, those who violated the Stamp Act were denied the right of trial by jury. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it." Altogether, these offenses led to revolution.
Following the Revolution, American colonists set up their own government, drawing from years of self-governance and British precedent. These ideas of rule of law, consent of the governed, limited government, and due process were implemented at all levels of the government. The Virginia Constitution reaffirmed that the proper role of government is to protect the people. The Massachusetts Constitution heavily asserted individual rights, beginning by naming 30 fundamental rights. The Constitution of the United States focused on rule of law and due process. This steady pace of progress underscores American government as well, because not only did we follow in the footsteps of the British paradigm, but we founded new ideas. For example, the Massachusetts Constitution highlighted checks and balances and the separation of powers. Besides emphasizing freedom of religion, unheard of in England, the New York Constitution was also amended over 200 times, which set the model of comprehensive change and improvement in our government.
This precedent is fundamental to American ideals. From Jamestown to now, America is consistent at implementing our governmental process and overturning our failures. Representative government, self-government, shown in the Virginia House of Burgesses, was an early success, while the Three-Fifths Compromise included in Article I of the Constitution was not. This practice of success and failure, trial and error, still impacts the American government today as we continue to revise and perfect our system. This is shown in the over 11,000 proposed amendments through American history. This is shown by the emphasis on due process rights in the Supreme Court case Miranda v. Arizona. This is shown in the Brown v. Board of Education, which accentuated the inherent inequalities in American society. While we learned much about the proper role of government from Britain, self-governance on a national scale was necessary for American colonists. Over the course of American history, we have made previously British ideals our own and created new ones along the way. Thank you. We stand ready for your questions.
So why do you think the colonists wrote down many of their rights on paper in contrast to their British counterparts?
Well, in Britain, they used common law, which is just like a known fact of how things are carried out from generation to generation. And through this way, sometimes things can get misconstrued over time, and the colonists it was very important to them that this would not happen, and that's why they ensured that most of their documents were written.
Many of the rights that the colonists did enumerate were violated. The first Virginia Charter granted all those born in the colonies the rights of Englishmen. However, these long train of abuses, such as search and seizure of their boats, as well as the revocal of trial by jury, removed the rights of the colonists, and the colonists made sure that by enumerating these rights, this would be prevented in the future.
In the two treaties of government, John Locke established that natural rights included life, liberty, and property. These rights were consistently violated by the British government pre-American Revolution. Following these consistent violations, it was necessary for the American colonists to codify their law to prevent these infringements from happening again.
What about the role of women? Your text did a great job of talking about some of these great men and these ideas. Is this period fatally flawed because the amount of women that had an impact?
I would say yes and no. While there was a lack of equal representation seen throughout the colonists, the American colonists took major steps forward in enfranchising more people. While only property-owning white men could participate in the American system, this was greatly expanded in the American colonies because property was so easy to obtain. So while it was not perfect and that it did not include women or African Americans or other oppressed groups at the time, it did take major strides forward in improving representation.
As well, the American Constitution was very radical for the time it was created, and I kind of like look with the amendment process as well as other things throughout our history between the people, slaves going from the south to the north and escaping, as well as women fighting for their right to vote. I kind of look at it as we didn't just have the American Revolution, but there have been small revolutions throughout our time in American history.
We also see in the 19th Amendment that women do eventually get the right to vote. So while they did not have this right at the time, America has expanded our rights to vote. And so starting at this point gives us the room to expand and continue to modernize our interpretation of the Constitution and the rights provided there.
I'm curious, you all did a nice job of explaining all the ways American rights were violated. What if Britain had offered representation in Parliament to the American colonists? Would that have solved the American Revolution, in your opinion?
I believe that the lack of representation was a big part as to why they revolted, but it wasn't the sole reason. Like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, they had those colonists who had violated the Stamp Act. They were brought to trial, but they were not brought to trial by jury by their peers in the colonies, but they were taken to England. This was obviously very unfair, as these protections of the vulnerable against the government were clearly violated.
In addition, while I agree with my colleague that representation could have helped forestall the revolution, we have no way of truly knowing how it would have affected the colonists' actions. And over the course of time before the American Revolution, again, these natural rights were consistently violated. The right to life was taken away from the American colonists. We see this in the Boston Massacre. We see this in the trials by admiralty courts, which would often skew the decisions in favor, or excuse me, against the defendants. The rights to liberty were violated with general warrants, and the revocable trial by jury and the rights to property were violated again with general warrants. So while we cannot truly say how increased representation would have forestalled these measures, it could have helped to prevent, but we cannot truly say.
As well, no taxation without representation was a major slogan that helped push forward the American Revolution. And the culture in the colonies had changed than the original colonists that came over directly from England. And I think if we had representation in Congress, Parliament, we would have had different opinions than them. And I don't know if it would have lasted. And going off of what April said, we aren't completely sure because it did not happen. But the cultures were very different at this point in time.
What do you think were some of the significant differences between colonial and British political institutions? It sounds like you've been mentioning what rights were afforded or written down or agreed upon and then not given. Was it just simply a codifying of those rights, or were there other things we added?
There are many major differences between the British and American constitutional system. For example, the executive branch has many major differences. In the British system, there is a monarch. We currently have a president. In the legislative branch, there are also many differences. For example, the prime minister has many of the powers that we have codified to give to our president. For example, being commander-in-chief, having the right to appoint, as seen in Article 1, Section 2. So it's in, Article 2. So there are many similarities between the British and American governmental systems.
I would like to add on to that. As April said, there were, I feel, a lot more similarities rather than differences. The legislative branch, for example, in England was composed of the House of Lords and House of Commons, and this could be equivalent to the bicameral legislature we had here in the colonies. Another part was that, as April said, there were in both separation of a lack of separation of powers. For example, in the colonial legislatures here, the upper chamber actually had the power of judicial review.
A lot of constitutional application, and man, at least in your opening statement, there was a lot of rapid fire. I mean, Articles 5, 6, 7, 8, you mentioned, you corrected yourself, Article 2, Section 2, good catch. Parts that may not have so easily been brought into this conversation. I think you did a good job of it. It wasn't just name dropping, it was at the application. I think maybe the case law was probably a bit of a reach in this particular conversation we were having. I don't think it's a negative so much as maybe in the future, if you're going to mention it, find a way to kind of bring that in, especially Brown v. Board of Education doesn't seem like, it seemed like it was kind of forced into this particular conversation. I love the example that property was so easy to obtain. Like that's a fantastic example of, whereas it was only property owners, but property was fairly easy to obtain for those who wanted to vote, absent the specific exceptions you mentioned. And I thought that was a very salient and very well done point. Good job.
I would echo my colleagues' comments. cover a broad swath of kind of philosophical history about the ideals of self-government, and to cover a wide swath of British history, and also this separate period of the history of the British colonists in America. And I think you all did a really nice job of covering all of that together in your statement, and then also being responsive to our questions and responding to that. I also like the ways in which you framed the positive aspects of the ways in which the founders crafted a system of self-government, while also recognizing the flaws of that system and the ways in which that's changed over time, and kind of brought that story a little bit further forward. So I thought you all did a nice job.
I was really disappointed, I should say, that more Americans can't see this. This is just absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'm sorry, I don't care if you don't take anything else away from this. One thought, topic headings a little bit more. You had your content right, you're moving quickly. I'm trying to stay up with you. I'm really, so can you look a little bit more, and I maybe, sorry to be specific, Riley, but Brown v. Board, Miranda, but you were already in those, and I wasn't quite sure what you were supporting. So, and you had transition sentences. I'm not saying you didn't, you certainly had them. But it's tough for us to stay with you. I don't know if you can work with that. Wow. The responsiveness when I asked about women, and you went broad, and you brought in African Americans and broader representation. You cited examples. I mean, you were way outside the unit, and it was beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
I think he's supposed to stay with you. I think that's President
We know more than
I was really happy.
Oh, you mean,
Guys, I know we can end the episode now, and then we watch it live.
he's at 9. We're doing great. It's awesome. Still don't really know what's going on, but it's okay. Yeah, just getting repeated, we don't know what's going on here. It's okay. Wait, guys, listen, what? No.
There was a phone that went off?
There's a day. Oh, that was mine.
Oh, we didn't.
I took my finger off.
No, I think you're a little.
I think we did it.
Yeah, we're ready.
Also, they come through.
Please be seated. my colleague here, how many years? 24. 24, yeah, so. We said good morning, we expect, the greeting of the day given with gusto.
Amazing.
It's been an exciting morning so far. All right. So this is Freeman. Yes?
Yes.
And we are Unit 2, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to introduce myself and allow my colleagues to introduce themselves, and then we will ask you to introduce yourselves, and we'll read the question, okay? All right, my name is Ben Fabian. I teach AP U.S. Government Politics here at Freeman High School. I got tapped in this morning because a judge called out, so I'm taking their place today. I am a James Madison Memorial Fellow for the state of Virginia from the year 2018. I am a We the People mentor teacher for the state of Virginia. And these are my colleagues.
Dr. Lisa Jordan, Professor of History and Political Science. Jack of all trades, master of none. I'll leave it at that.
Steve Mifflin, Colonel in the United States Army. This is my 20th year involved with We the People. So we've seen a lot of things going over the years of what's improved and what's looking forward to it. Somebody really catches fire.
Well, good morning. We are all students from Douglas Freeman High School, Team Marshall. My name is Kieran. My name's Jack.
My name is Brooke, and we are excited to have a conversation with you guys today.
Instructor?
Mr. Robtat.
Together.
Yes.
Okay. You have a question? Oh, yeah, I'll read. All right. How did the framers create the Constitution? When considering the House of Representatives, Brutus observed that a representative cannot possibly represent the feelings, opinions, and characters of a great multitude. In this respect, the new Constitution is radically defective. What would have led Brutus to this conclusion? What were the Federalist views regarding representation in the Constitution? And to what extent, if any, are the views of Brutus relevant today? You may begin.
Consent to the governed is a cornerstone ideal of American constitutionalism. One of the avenues through which the founders promoted this principle was the creation of a representative legislature. The founders agreed that citizens deserved representation. What they didn't agree on, however, was to what extent this representation should extend. Most anti-federalists agree with Brutus that representatives serving large districts would be incapable of reflecting all of the wants and needs of their constituents. They believed in the delegate theory of representation, that representatives should exactly reflect their constituents' views. Brutus noted that the very term representative implies that the person should resemble those who appoint them. They must be like the people. For this theory to work effectively, given the vast size and diversity of the United States, a larger House of Representatives would be necessary.
Anti-federalists also feared that the House was too small to prevent domination by the upper class. Brutus declared that the natural aristocracy of the country will be elected, that the legislature would become filled with only the rich seeking to expand their social power.
Perhaps the Anti-Federalists' biggest concern with the small size of the House of Representatives was a general distrust in the new federal government. George Mason predicted that the state and national government cannot exist long together. The one will destroy the other. In the eyes of the Anti-Federalists, a larger legislature preserving local voices would serve as an effective check against the growth and power of the federal government.
On the other side of the debate sat the Federalists, who believed in the idea that voters entrusted their representative to make the right decision for them, otherwise known as a trustee theory. Madison viewed trustee theory as a way in which to enlarge the public view by passing them through a medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of the nation. Because the federal government would rarely be involved in the daily lives of the citizens, it was less important that they specifically represent their own opinions and interests. The system of Republican federalism, ensured by Article 4 of the Constitution, allows for varying levels of representation, which correspond to the level of government, allowing for a more granular representation as the government became more local. In a way, this counters the anti-federalist point that the national legislature will place too much power in the hands of too few.
One of the Federalists' biggest concerns with the Anti-Federalist proposition of expanded representation was the prospect of mob rule. The Federalists feared a legislature too large would fall victim to what Madison referred to as the confusion and intemperance of the multitude. The Federalists believed that the most effective counter to this mob rule was by restricting the number of representatives in electoral districts.
Unlike the anti-federalists, Madison believed that their trustees would never betray the solemn trust committed to them. Even if some representatives proved to be tyrannical,
Madison noted that they can make no law which will not have its full operation on themselves and their friends. Also, constituents didn't feel their trustee was channeling public sentiment. They could be replaced via 2 short years in election. Our panel's perspective on the modern state of representation is divided, just as the founders were divided when drafting the Constitution 234 years ago.
Some argue that the concerns expressed by Brutus are just as, or perhaps even more relevant in 2021 as they were in 1787. For one, representative districts have exploded in size and population since the founding. This has led to the very thing that the Anti-Federalists feared, representatives who don't reflect the views of their constituents. Others contend that the federal system has become so dysfunctional that a debate over representation is a moot point. Because of the growth of the partisan system, the essence of what both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists thought representation should be has been destroyed. Political parties have gone from a linkage institution to the linkage institution. In modern America, all political activities filter through the party, diluting individual representation. Consent of the government is a complex issue. Part of its beauty is that it is up to the citizens to decide what it means. Do we want our representatives to be delegates, trustees, or partisans? Thank you. We stand ready for your questions.
Okay.
So much of the work that's done is done in committees. In what ways does this help or hinder true representation?
So one of the things that our legislative process does well is it has a lot of measures to stop bad bills from going through. One of these is committees. The founders thought that through making progress on bills slower and making passing legislation harder, it would allow for a more stable government, which was better than moving quickly and passing a bunch of legislation. One of the ways I think that committees is definitely more of a remnant of the idea of the trustee theory of representation, that we should be trusting the legislative process into a selected body of citizens. And what's better than this than putting that selected body into an even more selected body to truly discern what the best bills are and what the bills that we should pass for the good of our country.
Committees allow groups that have similar interests and similar wants and needs in our government to get together and talk about the change and reform they want to make in our government, and I think that that can only be viewed as a benefit and progression and talking about what we want.
Thank you. In your view, has the Constitution successfully controlled fashions, the way James Madison envisioned?
Partially. One of the things that George Washington warned about in his farewell address was evolving into political parties, something which is pretty obvious in America now. And especially with the binary system that we have, it's become so polarized that it's hard to say that we've controlled factions well. I think that there's certainly an argument to be made that there are certain benefits to factions. I mean, James Madison pointed out in many of the Federalist Papers that factions were actually a way in which to moderate power within the national legislature. One of the primary concerns of the founders was that this new national legislature would grow too powerful and grow too large. Factions within it allow for competing interests to kind of numb the edge of the sword that the founders worried they were giving the legislative branch.
I would also like to add that I believe that factions do the opposite of helping our government. I think that separating the two different political parties, we're almost a government divided. Right now, we're not seeing the same interests or the wants of our government as a whole, and both political parties have different wants and needs that they want, and often they're not really okay with compromising, which creates a very big issue in our government.
Okay. So you spent a good deal of time in your statement talking about a large body of representatives versus a smaller body of representatives. Do you think that the House of Representatives in its current size is adequate to represent Americans today?
So I actually think that it is absolutely not. The way that our current system is set up was basically precedented by the Reapportionment Act of 1929, which capped the size of the House of Representatives at 435. And this has allowed for there only to be a set number of electoral districts, thus ballooning the size of populations within those districts. The average district today is around 720,000 people. That is the average congressional district. This is 12 times larger than what the districts were at the time of founders. The founders actually knew this was going to be an issue, as evidenced by Federalist 55, where James Madison talks about how obviously you want the House of Representatives specifically to generally grow its population, but at a certain point you need to limit it to a certain number to avoid a lot of the pitfalls of direct democracy and getting a lot of the problems with the mob rule. So while we maybe expanding it is a good solution, it may not be the only solution.
To add on, the Constitution originally stated that it should be one representative per 30,000 constituents, and as Kieran stated, now that number is well above that. I believe that this inhibits direct representation from all of the people and can cloud a lot of voices that now cannot be heard. And although the Constitution did say that they knew this issue would come about, they have not proposed any way to solve it, and people feel that their representation is not equal.
Okay.
So, how do we determine what the bar is? I mean, do we go by polls, satisfaction rates? What are we looking at to make the determination?
Make the determination of what exactly?
The effectiveness of this representation.
So I think that, I mean, if we're looking at polls purely wise, only 29% of people actually are satisfied with their local legislature. So I guess that, or I guess the better way to put that and the way they put it in the poll is, do they feel that they're being adequately represented? And I feel like this is a really sad statistic, especially if we look back at what the Anti-Federalists thought that we should do with government, which was that essentially provide a direct lens through which the people can have access to their powers.
To add on to that, Hume Notes states that only 40% of Americans believe that their representatives are acting in the true interest of what they want, which is shocking and completely not what our government stands for. Our delegates are supposed to be directly representing what the country as a whole wants and our needs. And for the people of America to feel that that is not even being done out in our current government system, I believe that we need to reform this and change it so that people feel that their voices are being heard.
We can also see it.
Just very quickly, how would you support term limits? Yes or no, or your comments on term limits?
So James Madison talks about this in Federalist 57, where he mentions that term limits are a way for the people to actually control their delegates and their representatives, and that we can hold them more accountable even if we think that they are doing a good job. So it may be able to fix some of the problems that we talked about with the trust in federal government.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Good work. Give him a hand.
You structured your opening remarks. I like that model, and you definitely had an understanding of the many different ways and examples, and could kill for those in when you needed to. My only suggestion really is that instead of just mic dropping what you're talking about, infuse that with a direct example, meaning, okay, exactly how are the parties not compromising? Pull something out that, and Lord knows you got a lot to choose from, that, this is what happened and why, and these are the people who are involved. I'm just saying, take it just a step further. Same with like the poll, 29% from where? What poll was it? So I'm just saying, be a little bit more specific. The examples are fantastic. It's just well-rounded, and so I can appreciate the amount of time that you put into really thinking this through and being prepared for whatever was thrown at you. Thank you.
Likewise, I certainly agree to that. I believe that you believe in your hearts and the way you articulated this, that you understand and you believe that what you said is right. I like the difference between, each one of you maybe agreeing or disagreeing, and kind of going from there. Very well background, the slides, things you said, the references. Again, I agree with what my colleague says, be a little bit more specific, where it came from, who said it, and very good. I like your eye contact when you talk to us, and you talk to all of us, not just the person that asked the question. So I think you believe in what you said. That's one thing. You have confidence in how you presented it. There were many conversation, this is the way it is. So I would appreciate that.
Okay. I thought you guys did a fantastic job. I appreciated the Federalist 55 mention because that really kind of gets to the heart of the Federalist view of dealing with this problem, right? Federalist 55 is almost a direct response to Bruce 3. And so I appreciate the fact that you guys brought that in. I thought that the question about the number of representatives, I'm going to give you guys a pretty cool tool to use going forward. And this might be something that your Unit 3 brethren could help you out with as well. And that is that the original proposed First Amendment to the Constitution, it never got ratified, was actually aimed at dealing with this number. So it's 1 for every 30,000 until we get to 100 representatives, then 1 for every 40,000 until we get to 200, and then after that, 1 for every 50,000. That would result in about 6,700 something representatives today. But that's an opportunity to talk about something that probably a lot of people are not going to know unless they get deep in the weeds, that you could mention. I would have loved to have heard more about term limits. That's kind of a fun question for us. I'm glad that we got at least one person to be able to sort of weigh in on that. I did enjoy your discussion of delegate versus trustee versus partisan. I think that also kind of gets into the heart of it. What does it mean to be a representative? And I really, that would have been my next question if we had time, would have been to kind of go down that rabbit hole. There was one thing that I do want to echo though, and it's something that my fellow judge said, and that is make sure that when you are dropping evidence, so to speak, take the extra 5 seconds to just expand. Tell us where the poll came from. There was a question that you responded to earlier, and you kind of just mashed up what your colleagues said. You didn't really add anything new, and I appreciate that you're getting the participation point, but you're not necessarily getting the responsiveness point. Do you see what's going on there? So that's, when you're moving forward, that's the thing. Make sure that when you add something, you add something. Does that make sense? But other than that, I thought the participation was dead even. Everybody had something to say. Everybody had something generally of good quality to say, and your statement was outstanding. So I really enjoyed it. Well done. Okay. Not good. I always. Oh, you're very welcome. I hope you guys enjoy it. It's a little messy, but yeah, it's not as cool as it used to be.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you. Good job, thank you. Something different. It's the exact same. I'm not nervous.
Hello.
Good morning.
Yes, great. Please have a seat. So we are your Unit 3 judges. My name is Maria Garnett. I work in public policy and state government. I've been volunteering with We the People for about 3 years now. I'm so excited to be with you here today.
I'm Cash Earhart. I manage Oxford. I've been a volunteer with We the People for about a decade now.
Great, so please go ahead and introduce yourselves and your teacher.
Hi, we are students from Freeman T. Marshall. Our teacher is Rob Peck. Unfortunately, he's with the other class at this time. I'm Brooke Ward.
I'm Emily Waters. And I'm Ella Hurlbert, and we're looking forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. We had to sort of sprint up the stairs just now. Please forgive the.
Definitely not out of shape.
The Okay, here's your question. George Mason supported an amendment process, noting it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way than to trust to chance and violence. To what extent, if any, has Mason been proven correct about the amendment process? What role, if any, have other government institutions played in impacting the interpretation of the Constitution over time? And should the amendment process be changed or altered in any way? Explain your answer.
Federalist 43 states, quote, that useful alterations will be suggested by experience could not but be foreseen. It was requisite, therefore, that a mode for introducing them should be provided. It moreover equally enables the general and state governments to originate the amendment of errors as they may be pointed out by the experience on one side or on the other, end quote.
In 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. The amendment malfunctioned as organized crime rates skyrocketed and gangs manifested wealthy criminal enterprises from alcohol sales. The constitutional amendment process allowed Congress to enact the 21st Amendment, repealing the 18th Amendment and returning fundamental private rights to citizens. Congress observed the effects of their legislation and altered it when issues arose, demonstrating the truth behind Mason's belief that the country needs a specified amendment process to prevent civic outrage.
The Constitution can, however, be altered without the implementation of an amendment. In Gonzales v. Reich, the Supreme Court held that authorities possess the constitutional power to seize Gonzales's cannabis plants under the Commerce Clause, despite her lawful possession of the plants under the Compassionate Use Act, because private production and consumption would have a substantial effect on supply and demand in the national market. Here, the Supreme Court expands the powers granted in the Commerce Clause to regulate interstate production. The Supreme Court has the unchecked authority to determine the extent at which enumerated powers can be used. In this way, they affect not only the relevance of the amendment process, but also the interpretation of the Constitution.
The executive also plays a role in constitutional interpretation, as court precedent can rarely be enforced without executive support. In Worcester v. Georgia, President Andrew Jackson ignored Chief Justice Marshall's ruling on Native American land reservation restrictions and continued to impose regulations on Native American land, establishing the executive as the absolute authority. Moreover, President Abraham Lincoln strengthened executive authority when he spent $2 million without congressional appropriation during the Civil War, stating, quote, "I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional but might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation," end quote. Hamilton would have approved, for as he said in Federalist 70, quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government," end quote.
While the complicated amendment process is a precaution against the passage of dangerous or harmful amendments, it can also prohibit the passage of beneficial and necessary ones. For example, the Equal Rights Amendment proposed in 1972 stated that, quote, "equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," and was allowed to expire unratified in 1982. The Child Labor Amendment proposed in 1926 granted Congress the power to regulate the labor of children under 18, and the amendment is still outstanding.
John Locke's social contract theory offers the compelling argument that the governed should have direct say in ratification, leading Thomas Jefferson to believe the Constitution would become, quote, "an act of force and not of right," end quote, if not rewritten every 19 years. Roadblocks and difficulties involved in proposing a constitutional amendment prohibit us from being able to live up to Jefferson's expectations, demonstrating a significant weakness in the effectiveness of our current amendment process.
Article 5 of the Constitution allots two different methods of amendment. One is the formation of a constitutional convention, which has never been used on the national level, implying that the process is defective and difficult to depend on. The process requires 2/3 of the states to agree to call the convention, and decisions made within the conventions must be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures.
The process is far too cantankerous to be functional. However, this method is not a reflection of the effectiveness of the amendment process as a whole, as history has proven chance and violence rarely lead to political stability.
Various uprisings, such as the Arab Spring Uprising, occurred because the people didn't have a way to change their government and fell back to overthrowing it. While the amendment process is not perfect, it is certainly necessary so the evolution of our government is not left up to fate. Thank you, and we stand ready for your questions.
you mentioned the unchecked authority that the Supreme Court has with certain interpretations of constitutionality. And so I'm interested in your thoughts, should judicial review itself, is that as valid a way of either not necessarily amending the Constitution, but certainly indicating how it can be applied? Is that as valid a method of amendment as an amendment that were adopted by the people or ratified by state legislatures? Why or why not?
I think that judicial review, while is very important to check the legislative branch and their laws, it should not be up to the court to solely protect individuals' liberties. And I think really that there's a danger of the people feeling that the court is just gonna take care of it, we don't need to stand up and petition the government to make a change. So I think that really that could be a problem.
The judicial review is an important power to the judiciary because it's essentially the only check that they have over the executive and the legislature, because the executive
does not have to enforce a precedent set by the Supreme Court. So while judicial review is important, there can be situations where precedents set and decisions made, nothing really comes of them. Kind of an example of this, the vagueness doctrine has been part of constitutional law for a very long time. It states that if a law is brought to the Constitution, not to the Constitution, excuse me, to the courts, the courts can strike them down if they are too vague. This is kind of an example of, in a way, their weakness in acting as an amendment force. They can't rehabilitate a law that they strike down. Then there might still be a need for that law, but they can't fix the problems with it. They can only strike it down.
So in your statement, you made a statement that the Convention of States, correctly, it's never been employed. Can you think of any constitutional amendment for which a Convention of the States might be called that would be successful in amending the Constitution, or would there be any unforeseen consequences of adopting an amendment through the Convention of States?
The founders liked the idea of a supermajority, and I'm not sure that amending the Constitutional Convention would be right, because we would have to lower it to a number that would not be a supermajority because of the highly polarized environment that we are in politics today. Because let's face it, states probably aren't going to agree, especially not 3/4.
Yeah, going off of what Brooke said, I don't know if we could find an issue that 3/4 of the state would agree on. I think maybe term limits. I think maybe 3/4 of the states would ratify an amendment imposing term limits for Congress. Other than that, I can't really think of an issue that would be able to make it through a convention or the regular process.
With this idea of the founders liking the idea of a supermajority, certainly in some circumstances, we have this ongoing discussion right now about the filibuster in the Senate. So I'm wondering what, if anything, about what you know about the constitutional amendment process could address or shed light on how to resolve this issue.
I believe we need 3/4 votes in the Senate and in Congress to stop a filibuster, correct?
So there's a 60 vote threshold. So in the Senate, that's
A little less than 2/3.
Yeah, gotcha.
Is amending the Constitution necessary, for example, to fix this problem and allow Congress to govern?
I think so. I think that in Federalist 51, James Madison outlines the separation of powers and how important that is to creating an effective government. And I think that we do need to put it in the Constitution so that Congress can't change their own powers.
Okay, so what would the amendment look like then? When you say we need to put it into the Constitution, what specifically?
The amendment for filibusters?
Well, filibusters basically stop the legislative process from happening, and I think that is really harmful to the separation of powers and just the functioning of government in general, because issues are brought to the legislature and bills are brought to the legislature because the American citizens want to see that change happen. And so when they filibuster and try to just put off talking about those issues, it kind of is detrimental to the idea of democracy.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, if there's anything that's going to stop the legislative process, I would not support that. I think that there's so much that needs to be done in our country, and it's hard enough to get anything through Congress as it is when we're always fighting and we're so polarized. So I think that we need to keep the legislative process going as much as we can. What that amendment would look like in particular, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it would have to go through committee, it would have to go through both houses with the 2/3 vote, and then it would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state. So it would essentially have to be perfect.
Do you think it would be possible for an amendment to be considered unconstitutional?
Yes, actually the 18th Amendment was considered unconstitutional because it was infringing on the private rights of citizens to be able to purchase alcohol, which really wasn't harming. It's like cigarettes. They chose to make that decision to drink that thing that is harmful to them, and it's not the government's decision to decide that they can't do that.
I would disagree. I would say that it's up to the judiciary to interpret the Constitution, and if they're deciding whether something is constitutional or not, if it's already in the Constitution, then it is inherently constitutional.
So should we be able to prohibit a constitutional amendment from even being considered then, if it's just believed to violate the spirit of the Constitution at present?
I mean, I think the big problem with the Prohibition Amendment was it was about public policy. It wasn't really about constitutional law. So, I mean, if we do have an amendment that we're looking at that is about public policy and isn't really related to our interpretation of the Constitution in particular, then yes, I think it should be prohibited from being considered.
Furthermore, nope. We are at time. Thank you. Take a deep breath.
Thank you.
Stop for you guys. I really appreciated that, you all were not afraid to respectfully disagree with one another, for example. And even though some of our questions maybe initially seemed to be maybe something you weren't expecting to get, you engaged with the issue. You didn't back down, and just keep up that good work. If you continue on through this process, judges can always ask questions that you didn't necessarily explicitly prepare for. And so I think you did a good job anchoring back to the knowledge that you do have in continuing on that path. I was asking about the filibuster in part because the filibuster is a Senate rule, that institution can solve that problem, and I actually don't think that that's the sort of thing that a constitutional amendment would be appropriate for. So sometimes try to take a step back and see the forest and not get so lost in the exact tree of it. Sometimes we really do want to see, do you understand how this whole machine is working together, even when you're focusing on one issue? Again, you spoke with conviction, and I really appreciated how many, good examples you were able to give, looking back to the Federalist Papers, for example, looking at different points in our country's history, to make your point. So, great job.
Yeah, I thought you had several good examples that I wasn't expecting to hear, and that we haven't heard from any of the other teams yet. So good job with that. I liked your argument, the court shouldn't be the sole defender of the rights of the people under our current process. I would have liked to have heard what modifications could be made to alleviate them of that burden. What could we do to make the process more equitable, more just for the people? So yeah, don't hesitate to say, yes, here's what the problem is, but then, here's a possible solution. It's oddball, it will never get enacted, but show me that you're rationalizing how these old, rich, white, dead guys still affect us today, and what we can do to make up for their deficiencies.
Yeah. Another point that I think could be useful, this unit in the textbook gets into political parties a little bit, right? In addition to the broader conversation about amending the Constitution. You know, about a decade ago, it was close to enough state legislatures within full control of the Republican Party, for example, that they actually were getting close to being able to call a constitutional convention and to amend the Constitution that way. Those efforts were supported by major organizations receiving a lot of dark money contributions, for example. We did come close to that, right? So think about how all of the topics in a given unit could be interacting together. You know, I think that could have been a good opportunity to discuss, yeah, no, the American people, it would be very, very hard to genuinely get them to agree on anything to that level, but if you have such outsized influence for one party or another, we could actually go in that direction, and it would be constitutional, technically. So yeah, just thinking creatively. I encourage you to do that as much as you possibly can. So yeah, great job, y'all.
Thank you. Very much. Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you.
We don't change things.
Oh, thank you.
It's held its own authority. Yeah, literally.
Yeah, I would have like, they have a break.
I thought about it.
There's no break? Isn't there a bottom? Jack?
It's not in the Constitution.
Jack, Claire, Cameron, we're so ready to go. You started us up last time.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was. Use this and this and this. Yeah.
I was like, all right.
Okay, we're not saying anything about it. We're just.
It's okay.
Yeah, well, we're good.
We could have gone.
Yeah, I think they need to. One of your opening statements.
Yeah.
But you're saying you're too tight.
Rick, did you? I put it like here.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't hear you start speaking, so.
We got this. We had to wait last time.
3 left.
This is the short one. Nothing.
Dang it,
Russell, I swear to God.
Judge Russell.
Great, thank you. You want to come over here? Hello, please be seated.
We're a little out of breath, I'm sure probably all of your judges have been, because we're making that trip from the main area. So this is Freeman, Team Brennan, and Marshall.
Right? Yeah, Marshall.
Marshall, okay, my apologies. Whew. Right. And this is unit 4.
Yes, sir.
Right? So I'll introduce myself, my co-judges will introduce themselves, and then you will introduce yourself. Whew. I'm sorry, I'm really.
Do you want me to start?
All right, my name is John Fuller. For 28 years, I was with the Supreme Court of Virginia, and now I am retired and doing a little private practice, specializing in state court appeals.
My name is Tamara Bynum. I'm an attorney with the Board of Veterans Appeals. We're the administrative body for the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. I'm really happy to be here and can't wait to hear your presentation today.
And I'm Rich Marr. I teach politics at Randolph-Macon College, which you should have been at today. Come visit another time. Thank you. Great to see you.
Good morning, Ross Stevens for Freeman Team Marshall. I'm Jack.
I'm Claire.
And I'm Cameron. Our teacher is Mr. Rob Packey is with the other Freeman team right now. We are excited for our conversation today.
So I will read question 3, and you will have 4 minutes for your opening statement. To what extent, if any, has the court's power of judicial review served to balance individual liberty and the common good? What judicial philosophy should guide the decision-making of the courts? And what criteria do you think should be used to determine whether a Supreme Court decision is a landmark decision?
The power of judicial review, though not explicitly delegated to the Supreme Court in the Constitution, is understood to be a well-established power reserved for the judiciary as a result of Madison. Yet the magnitude of this power is what initially led to the anti-federalist fears of the judicial branch, as expressed in British 15. The powers, such as judicial review, could allow justices to impose personal opinions on the country rather than hold laws accountable to the Constitution. It is true that the power of judicial review inevitably brings opinions into the court, and therefore asks the justices to either try to find balance with the two.
Individual liberty and the common good seem to frequently be at odds with one another. In the case of DC v. Heller, the Second Amendment is defended, and personal liberties expanded at the potential expense of the common good. On the other hand, a ruling for the common good is clearly seen in Korematsu v. U.S., in which the court decided it was constitutional to intern Asian Americans for the common defense during World War II. But we look back on and condemn this decision. However, this being said, personal liberties and the common good are not exclusively polar ideas. In the case Brown v. Board of Education, the court was able to balance both the common good and individual liberty. Desegregation of America both uplifts human personality, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say, and was integral in establishing a unified American society.
Judicial review's subjective nature allows for vastly different philosophies within the legal system, ranging from a restrictive originalist to a flexible evolutionary interpretation. Originalists believe that the Constitution means the same thing today as it did when it was written, that the founders did not intend for the courts to have the power to change the meaning of their words. That was reserved for amendments. Meanwhile, an evolutionary interpretation considers the Constitution to be a living document that evolves with society. It focuses on fundamental themes and rules based on how those principles have evolved over time.
We as a group find ourselves conflicted between which philosophy should guide the decision-making of the court. Some of us believe that the originalist interpretation is the better option, because it asks judges to adhere most closely to the texts and limits legislation to the bench. This philosophy echoes the sentiments expressed in Federalist 78, in which Hamilton writes, "The courts must declare the sense of the law, and if they should be supposed to exercise will instead of judgment, the consequence would equally be the substitution of their pleasure for that of the legislative body."
However, others in our group believe that an evolutionary interpretation should be used to guide the courts as it adapts for our ever-changing society. This philosophy has been used in cases such as Roper v. Simmons, in which the court decided whether a law allowing the execution of minors was constitutional under the Eighth Amendment. The court voted in favor of Simmons, stating that while executing minors was not considered cruel or unusual in 1776, society and its values have since evolved. This case demonstrates how an evolutionary approach can be beneficial to society without changing the fundamental themes of the Constitution.
Many of the cases we have already mentioned share a common trait. They're widely considered landmark decisions. Landmark decisions are in part defined by the notable impact that they have, which in turn shift our daily life or systems of government. There are numerous decisions made by the court that have impacted not only those living at the time, but the course of our nation's history. Cases such as Mapp v. Ohio and Miranda v. Arizona, just to name a few. There's no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter formula to determine what is or isn't a landmark decision. It's more subjective than that. But it is important to note these landmark cases are ones that best exemplify the balance of individual liberties and common good.
Judicial review and the judicial philosophies that it fosters is a process that is deeply ingrained within the legal system. And despite the controversy surrounding its powerful nature, it has been a key part of the important and influential decisions that have and will continue to shape our society. Thank you. We stand ready for your questions.
Thank you for your materials. The fact that you acknowledge that your group has differences, we wouldn't be having a congressional hearing on these issues if there weren't differences. But I'm curious as to, given the range that you identified from restrictive to the evolutionary ideas, how does that square with the debate that occurred at the time of the Constitution as to whether the judicial branch was going to be too powerful or the least powerful?
I think that it's very important to note Federalist 78, in which Hamilton writes about the will versus the judgment. He acknowledges, in contrast to Brutus 15, where Brutus brings up that the court can be too powerful with 9 people that really just get to hand down their decisions to the country. The power of the court is really to just give opinions. They don't have the power of the sword or the purse to enforce any of these decisions. So truly the courts, other than having an influence on how society perceives government, they don't have anything to enforce their opinions.
This is also evident with their discussions within the Constitutional Convention. They discussed other options for judicial review as seen in the Virginia plan, in addition to what our forms that we have today.
And yeah, as we see judicial reviews a key check on the other branches. It's kind of what makes the judiciary somewhat equal to them. It's a key check on the executive and the legislative. But there is checks on judicial review, such as, like Jack mentioned, we don't necessarily have to, they can't enforce it. We don't have to listen to their rulings, such as in Worcester v. Georgia, when Andrew Jackson disregarded the court's ruling. We can also pass amendments, although it takes a long time to do that. The legislative can pass amendments if they see fit, such as the 16th Amendment, where the court ruled that an income tax was unconstitutional, and then the legislative passed a law making it constitutional.
So you've acknowledged this conflict amongst your team, right? About whether you're team originalist or team living documents. I want you to take a side, but I'm not going to say to do that. What I will say is, can you give us an example, or two or three, of a time where you feel like the conflict, right, between these two ways of interpreting the court's power have come into play, and how they have interacted together?
So I think it can clearly be seen where this conflict comes into play in segregation. As Plessy v. Ferguson, you definitely see it more as an originalist approach to the Constitution, as nowhere within it says that separate but equal is unconstitutional, as long as equal rights are granted to both African Americans and white citizens. Theoretically, that could exist, but also a more activist or evolutionary approach that comes out in Brown v. Board of Education is that we know that this is now morally incorrect and our society has evolved far enough that we can no longer stand by that decision that was made against us.
And my thoughts on the conflicting judicial philosophies is that I think different cases kind of require you to look at it through different lenses. Although this could pose a couple of issues, such as justices kind of picking and choosing what they want to view it as, I do think that there are things that the founders couldn't have possibly thought of when writing the Constitution, such as social media. How will we rule on that from the Constitution, which says nothing about it? But I do think an originalist interpretation can be the safer bet sometimes, sticking to the words in the Constitution. You almost can't go wrong in some cases.
And I have to agree with my colleague here that an evolutionary interpretation does have some beneficial aspects, that it can apply what the founders originally intended into a modern society in which our values have changed. An example of this could be Troop v. Dulles, in which a deserter from the army was, as punishment, his citizenship was taken away. And this was considered not even that cruel of a punishment, like in 1776, where a deserter from the army would have just been shot. But in modern context, our society has evolved and our values have evolved, that we do consider that to be cruel and unusual. And this is just another example of how an evolutionary interpretation can take the original intent and apply it to a modern context.
I want to push back at this idea, which I really appreciate, where you're saying kind of landmark, you kind of have to, very judicial Supreme Court of you know it when you see it, kind of almost. But I do want to push back against it a little bit. Are there any features of cases that you would say are usual for a landmark case? Maybe you said this, but I didn't quite get it. Like, what could you look for? Is it just controversial policy, or is there something about the law that makes something a landmark case?
We think a landmark case, something that can normally be seen more after the fact, is that it is frequently relied on as a precedent or a super precedent, as Amy Coney Barrett has called it these days. Roe v. Wade, Miranda v. Arizona, rights that the court is giving in these cases that didn't exist before, that are really fundamental to society now, and it would be possibly detrimental for the court to rule against them.
And I think what makes it so hard to determine what a landmark case is, is that I think that even some bad rulings, such as Dred Scott, I think we still need to consider that as a landmark decision. We can't just pretend like it never happened. I think we need to look back on cases such as that and improve on and learn from those mistakes. So I think that both good and bad decisions that we look back on today both need to be considered.
Yes, I would agree with the landmark decisions, not necessarily being the ones that are good and have changed society for the better, but ones that have marked a crucial turning point within our judicial system, whether it be for the
wanted to give you a little bit of a critique. First of all, you're the first group we've seen on this question that right out of the gate acknowledge there are two very different viewpoints on this, and we don't have the answer. Every group before this has sort of picked a side, and that's okay too. I mean, that's okay, but I really appreciate the fact that you sort of took the approach of, this is an issue that we're gonna talk about, not one that we're gonna tell you what the answer is. You do need to speak up a little, especially with the math. Sometimes it was a little hard to hear you. If I'm not mistaken, you're the first group to mention Korematsu, which I think is a great example for a decision that at the moment is correct from the benefit that I've often thought that Korematsu was really meant more to, you know what we talk about now if we go to the airport and they talk about security theater. That sometimes it's more important for the government to make us feel safe, even if what it's doing isn't actually safe. And as grossly unfair as Korematsu was to people of Japanese heritage, if you were there at that time in that context, it would have been very hard to find anyone in the country that would have said, you can't do that, because we had just been attacked. So you know, I think a lot of times we overlook the historical context of Dred Scott, of Korematsu, or of Brown, for that matter. So I think your answer to the second question went on a little bit too long, kind of robbed us of some time to have a more in-depth conversation. With 3 team members, I know it's hard because you want everybody to participate, but sometimes if all you're gonna do is sort of repeat what somebody else said and maybe throw in another example, but you're just really not adding anything to it, it's okay to let another question be asked. But overall, a very good job.
I would agree, very, very good job. You guys hit all of your time markers like again, this is a 3-person team, so that's a little bit more heavy lifting for each one of you, and I think it's all handled really well. I like your use of examples throughout. They were applicable to the question that was asked, and they were relevant. I know I said, I want you to pick a side, but that being said, the fact that you didn't piqued my curiosity, right? And it really made me want to listen, to pick up on what was the interplay between your team? What are those differences? How are you gonna bring those out? And I think you did a good job. So, well done.
Yeah, we're trying to beat the rush, but
Yeah.
I wanted to just mention the one question, sort of like suggestion I would make is, you talked a lot about Brutus and like the Virginia plan. Are these really questions about judicial review, which technically doesn't exist at this point, or is this really more about judicial power? Right, Brutus is not talking about judicial review, he's talking about the strength of the courts as a branch, and I felt that nuance was a little bit lost. So just something to think about for the future, but otherwise, excellent work, thank you so much. Great job. We're trying to be
Ready for the parquet? Ready for 60, 60, 60?
Please rise for your judges. Go ahead, take a seat, please. Welcome. Douglas Freeman, Team Marshall, correct?
Yes, sir.
How are y'all today?
Good, how are you? Love the tie. Very fitting.
You kind of have weird people tie on.
Of course.
States I have a different one. So my name is Jamie Moore. I'm a teacher at Peaceburg High School and a We the People alumni. And our judges will introduce themselves, and please introduce yourself and your teacher afterwards, please.
Good morning, I'm John Argenbaugh, and I teach political science at VCU.
I'm Justin Bates. I went to Hermitage High School, so I'm sorry. But I work at Monticello, which is a plantation home in Thomas Jefferson.
So we are Unit 5 of Douglas Freeman Team Marshall. Our teacher is Mr. Rob Peck. My name is Annabelle Glassman.
My name is Camille Kidwell. My name is Christina Kong.
My name's Sydney Keller, and we're excited for our conversation with y'all today.
Let's begin. We ought not to be part with the trial by jury. We ought to guard this and many other privileges by a Bill of Rights, which cannot be invaded. Why was the right to a jury trial so important to the founders? What are some advantages and disadvantages of a jury trial? Which rights included in procedural due process rights do you believe are most important and why? Good luck.
Both the legislative and executive branches are limited by the ultimate democratic check, voting. However, when it comes to the judicial branch, we the people have no direct check on who sits behind the bench. In lieu of voting, the Constitution grants us an alternate check on the judiciary, the jury system.
Its roots lie within early British common law. Magna Carta solidified that the government could not take away an individual's rights without the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. By 1670, Bushell's case had further established the validity of juries by returning the verdict that juries cannot be punished for the verdict they return.
In colonial America, trial by jury was the people's most powerful check on the government, as demonstrated by the Zenger case. Despite sufficient evidence, the jury refused to convict, therefore establishing the precedent that, quote, jurymen are to see with their own eyes, to hear with their own ears, and to make use of their own consciences and understandings. Furthermore, the Declaration of Independence cited the deprivation of the benefits of trial by jury as a main grievance in response to the intolerable acts limits on the efficacy of juries. This is seen through provisions such as prohibiting colonial juries and royal judges selecting jurors. Hence, the founders ensured the right to a jury trial.
This ideal was so important to the founders that it is one of two things that appears in the Constitution twice. This is seen in both the Sixth Amendment and Article 2, guaranteeing an impartial jury for the accused, and therefore protecting people when they are at their most vulnerable to the government.
In Federalist Paper 83, Hamilton further reiterates this sentiment, writing that juries prevent arbitrary impeachments, arbitrary methods of prosecuting pretended offenses, and arbitrary punishments upon arbitrary convictions. However, in Spark and Hansen v. United States, juries shifted from an independent check to a subset of the court which determines facts. This case resolved previous questions about the duty of juries. In Justice Harlan's decision, he said, while juries answer facts, the court answers the laws. Thereafter, this power has been used to ensure a fair and unbiased trial. On the other hand, one limitation of a jury trial found today is in voir dire, which allows attorneys to choose juries which are more likely to reach the desired verdict. Batson v. Kentucky established that striking qualified jurors based on race is unconstitutional. However, attorneys still find alternate race-neutral ways to strike jurors. In Turner v. Murray, Justice White, delivering the majority opinion, stated that the judge's failure to ask potential jurors about racial prejudice during voir dire led to a biased jury, resulting in the execution of the defendant. Another point of conflict is the differing point of view of judges and juries. Jurors typically rely on common sense justice. We as a panel disagree. Christina and Sydney are on the side of common sense justice to allow it to remain a check on the judiciary, while Annabelle and I prefer decisions to be based on written laws alone.
While each step in procedural due process works interdependently, given the limitation of juries, the most important right granted by due process is that of the right to counsel. This right, solidified by the Supreme Court in Gideon v. Wainwright, is vital to navigating the complex American judicial system.
Throughout proceedings, the right to counsel is applied in numerous areas, with increased relevance as the risk of conviction heightens. By guaranteeing counsel, the people are able to check the judiciary, taking away its potentially tyrannical power over those at their mercy on trial. In an adversarial system, a defendant cannot be effective against the prosecution, an officer of the executive branch, without the right to counsel. It is
fundamental to maintain a check on our government. Procedural due process provisions, such as juries and the right to counsel, act not only as protection from the government, but also as the embodiment of the people in the judiciary. And in a democratic system, what could be more important? Thank you, and we stand ready for your questions.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Quigley. I'll start you off. Big board? Come on.
What are some advantages and disadvantages of having a unanimous verdict?
One of the disadvantages that we see of a unanimous verdict is that a lot of times jurors might be willing to suppress their own opinions to kind of speed up the trial and, get out of jury duty. A lot of people have a lot of negative feelings about jury duty, so that definitely makes me feel a little bit upset that people might be willing to suppress their own opinions just to, speed up the process of a trial.
However, for those who are willing to go through this process, it does end up being beneficial that juries are required to be unanimous because it requires more intense deliberations in that either side has to convince the entirety of the panel that the specific facts that they noted either are true or are different than the others might view them.
Originally in Johnson v. Louisiana, the Supreme Court upheld that juries do not have to be unanimous. However, later this was overturned by Ramos v. Louisiana.
And in Louisiana, where they didn't have to have a unanimous jury, this actually stemmed from Jim Crow legislation, where basically even if you had 2 black jurors, if you only needed 10 out of 12 to convict, those 2 black jurors' opinions did not matter at all. And so in Louisiana, I believe they have 1,500 defendants who are convicted with non-unanimous juries, and 80% of those defendants are black.
My question touches upon something that was mentioned in your prepared remarks. You all identified the right to legal counsel as one of the most important procedural due process rights. How would you address the concern of the, shall we say, lack of quality legal representation for poor and people of color defendants?
This is obviously a very serious issue in our judicial system and one of the most one of the biggest questions that we face today. In Justice Black's dissent in Betts v. Brady, he reiterates this point, which Betts v. Brady set the precedent that public defenders are not required. However, Justice Black's dissent stated that this would inherently create pretty much a class differential between those who can afford juries and those who cannot.
And another big case is in Powell v. Alabama, and this is following the Scottsboro Boys case. And in Powell v. Alabama, they set the precedent that you had the right to counsel. And because the Scottsboro Boys lacked adequate counsel and they were not timely and they had a lot of deficiencies, that was the main reasons why they were convicted and did not have access to a fair trial.
And while the system as we see it today is flawed, something is better than nothing in the judicial system in the way that it's set up. It is important for people to have somebody who's a professional, who knows what they're doing, to sort of walk them through. And yes, an expert would be better, a higher quality counsel would be better, but in some cases, something is better than nothing.
Well, going back to the foundation is, why did the framers feel it was important for trials to be conducted in the vicinity of the crime?
So we see the origins of what becomes enumerated in the Constitution through the Vicinage Clause in early British law, where juries were self-informing, meaning that they came in with the information that they provided about the case. And so that was extremely important because unless you were a member of the community, you weren't aware of what was going on around, setting the origin sort of this principle.
However, there are some exceptions to this rule in cases such as the Boston Bombers trial and the trial of Derek Chauvin. These were both taken out of the community just because it simply would have been impossible to find 12 people that would be unbiased and to make a decision that would protect the defendant's rights to an unbiased jury.
Now, because most juries nowadays are starting to seem irrelevant because of plea bargaining, should we still have jury trials, or should the bench trials just be the only priority?
I think it's really important that we continue having jury trials to continue to involve regular citizens in our government, and this also acts as a check on our government, having those people involved. And it's
just really beneficial to the community as a whole as well, getting people, you know, civically engaged, and this is just participating in a jury is one of your civic duties as a citizen.
And in some cases, a biased judge could be way more detrimental. And so recently with the Chris Beltner case, where basically he raped a few women, and while he pleaded guilty, the judge basically said that he preyed on the decision, and instead of giving him a conviction, they instead just gave him parole. And so I think that could be a possible deficiency of relying on a judge versus a jury.
Additionally, one more reason that the right of counsel is just further important in due process is based on the number of plea deals that we see. The right of counsel here is going to be extremely important in advising the defendant whether to take it or not, and just to bargain for the defendant, and rather than just to be his defense or their defense.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and follow up on something you all just mentioned, okay? So why would a defendant take or want a bench trial instead of a jury trial?
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
So jury trials, one of the cons against them is that it can be easily manipulated emotionally. I was an intern at the circuit court clerk's office this summer, and while observing cases, I saw many cases in which, depending on who kind of controlled the emotions, whether it was the defendant or if the victim was younger, or in certain different cases, emotions were able to be used to sort of convince the jury. And so if the emotions were against the defendant, then they would want to take a plea deal or a bench trial instead of.
Thank you. We could keep talking for hours on this. Good, and I'm pretty sure I had a couple follow-ups. I was trying to give my colleagues a chance to actually talk to you. So I was actually really impressed that, one, you actually gave your point of view in the 4 minutes. Most people avoid this, and I really like that. Y'all were actually telling us right off the bat how y'all done and kind of challenged y'all to come at it. So at states, they probably will do this. So be ready for that. But I'm glad y'all did that, and if we had had more time, definitely would have done that. And actually, giving your answers was awesome, and going and talking about the, people just don't want to be on the jury. People are flat out refused. Y'all the first one to mention that today, so thank you for doing that. People just don't want to serve on jury, so it's actually really hard to find a good jury when somebody's just like, okay, I'm getting $35 for the day, let me get out of here as fast as I can, guilty. Okay, I'm out. So, good job with that, and I like how everybody talked, and you all kind of played your own roles, so that's good. It's really good to see y'all working off each other, so really impressed, and please thank your teacher for the great job y'all did as well.
Like my colleagues, really impressed with how you all responded to our questions. The other impressive thing was your command of Supreme Court cases. And I don't think any of you all knew this, but I did my dissertation on Byron White, so when one of you all went ahead and mentioned Byron White, kudos. So well done. Justin.
I was impressed that I think for every question, everyone answered. And I think you all expressed your own perspectives. And I appreciated that you even set that up in in your more opening statement, that you went ahead and said, you know, this is where we differ on some of these topics. But you each had cases and examples to back up every perspective that you gave. So I appreciate that.
Great job.
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you so much.
You ready? Oh, you know it. You got it.
Was that good? Hey, not this year. Six. Good job. Right here. Stand up.
just got around before.
Alright guys, we got this.
We're ready to go.
It just, when it was happening, it felt like the world was ending. Yeah. It was like, oh, no. Yeah, because it was a bad one.
Maybe next time we just say.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're so ready to go.
Yeah.
I'll go back.
So good.
You can do it, Morgan. We got it.
We've got a few minutes, but I'm not right now. Just let me know when you're ready. Please rise for your judges. Good morning. Please be seated.
Good morning, this is Unit 6. Okay, great. I am Nate Kubek. I'm from the University of Virginia Center for Politics. And we are here. I run the Youth Leadership Initiative, but I'm a teacher before that. I'm gonna let my judges introduce themselves.
I have Tic Tacs in my mouth, so my throat's really dry, so. I'm Cindy Burgett. I'm a retired We the People coach, teacher. I totally know what y'all are going through, and thank you. This is a lot of work, and I appreciate what you're about to converse with us.
And my name is John Barton. I'm a retired Presbyterian minister. Served as head of the Virginia Council of Churches for almost 20 years. And most of that time I was privileged to also be a judge with We the People. Look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. So good morning. We're Douglas Freeman's team marshal. Our instructor is Mr. Peck, and he is with the other team right now. I'm Taylor Whitfield.
I'm Morgan Loria.
I'm Grayson Warner. And I'm Russell Nystrom, and we're excited to have a conversation today.
Thank you.
All right, so we are dealing with Unit 6, which discusses the challenges that America may face as a constitutional democracy in the 21st century. Your question number 3, we have no eternal allies. We have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual. And these interests, or those interests, it is our duty to follow. Do you agree or disagree with this view of foreign policy, and why? You know, what foreign policy challenges does the United States face in the 21st century? And what role, if any, should the United States play in promoting democracy around the world? Take a deep breath, and then begin.
231 years after the fires of our revolution, the solemn tune of the Star-Spangled Banner rang out in Buckingham Palace in a show of defiance of 600 years of British tradition to honor all those who died in the attacks on 9/11. Though it was a dark time, it was acknowledgement of what was known for years, that the U.S. and Britain had built a strong relationship. And while that relationship clearly shifted, once we built a strong alliance, it lasted for centuries, through many different presidential administrations, foreign policy doctrines, and many different periods of reconstructing our national interests.
Specifically in the 21st century, our interests are more dynamic than ever. With the majority of diplomacy now being carried out through executive agreements, as declared constitutional by the Supreme Court in U.S. v. Belmont, it just takes 4 years for our interests abroad to take a complete 180. In the tail end of his presidency, Barack Obama committed the United States to the Paris Climate Accord. Just 1 year after that, Donald Trump announced that the U.S. would withdraw from the accord, and then just 1 month into his presidency, Joe Biden re-entered the United States to the agreement. The next president could also subsequently withdraw from the agreement again with just the stroke of a pen.
Despite Palmerston's statement, the United States allies are much closer to being eternal than our interests. And as time has gone on, this has only become more true. The over-reliance on the executive branch for foreign policy direction has caused our national interests to be reconstructed every 4 years. Despite the inconsistency of our interests, many of our alliances have fought for centuries. Since the 1800s, both Great Britain and France have been two of the United States' closest allies, with the U.S. even going so far as to work with the UK to liberate France from Nazi control during World War II.
As one of the world's global superpowers, it is imperative that the United States looks itself in the mirror and evaluates the future of foreign policy. There are no historical precedents for the current issues plaguing the world. Cybersecurity, human trafficking, and most notably, climate change exceed borders. It will take the entire world coming together to achieve meaningful change. And as we transition into a new global order, we must recognize that building allies and encouraging cooperation has become our paramount national interest.
However, not every issue America faces today is a novel one. Just as the USSR in the 1960s, China is rising up to challenge the authority that the United States has over the world. Through trade and vaccine diplomacy, the Chinese Communist Party seeks to increase China's influence over the developing world. If this goes unchallenged, corruption and authoritarianism will be able to fester and American economic interests will be in danger. With an ongoing trade war between the two nations, an increase in the economic power of China could lead to a decline in America's global influence. Furthermore, China isn't our only threat. The ever-militaristic presence of Russia is endangering their neighbors like Ukraine and forcing the United States to once again make a hard decision between intervening or steering clear of a conflict.
Another question America must ask itself is whether or not to promote democracy worldwide.
global increase in democracy would be a boon for the United States. As democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies, democratic nations are less likely to contribute to refugee crises, and other democracies would be more likely to economically interact in a healthy manner with the United States. But most importantly, democracies would be significantly more likely to aid the United States in today's foreign policy challenges. If we want to be able to solve human trafficking, climate change, and other issues, we will need other countries to work with us in good faith. And simply put, democracy would better facilitate that than autocracy. While this doesn't mean that we ought to militarily intervene in sovereign countries or that we shouldn't learn from our prior interventions, it does mean that it would be in our best strategic interest to peacefully promote democracy abroad.
Thank you, and we stand ready for your questions.
So, am I to understand from your presentation that you are not in full agreement certainly with this quote?
So we're not in full agreement with the quote. We believe that our interests are consistently changing, and they're changing every 4 years. We also believe that our allies are capable of change, but that allies tend to stick a bit more than our interests, since they're changing every 4 years with the president.
We bring up the Paris Climate Accord as an example of our interests changing, but I think another interesting example of that is the Iran nuclear deal that was entered by Barack Obama and then immediately withdrawn by Donald Trump when he was sworn in as president.
And the authorization for use of military force is just another example of power being given to the president, which has led to this rapid change in our interests every 4 years. It's led to stuff like the Paris Climate Accord and like the Iran nuclear deal.
Do you think we should change that to make so that our interests are more stable? Will that make our country safer?
I think in some sense it certainly will. It certainly will. When we look at the advice and consent clause in our country's founding, we realized there was meant to be at least some sort of split between Congress and the president in determining our foreign policy future. And today it is simply entirely vested in the president, which leaves us not being able to create stable long-term foreign policy.
And while I completely agree with my colleague, I do think that it should be noted that executive agreements do allow for a bit of inconsistency to other nations not being able to predict what the United States' next actions are going to be. Donald Trump was a different change to a lot of countries. He did a lot of different things in terms of foreign policy that previous presidents didn't do, and it kind of made a lot of countries on their toes when it came to the United States and what they were going to do.
I think for the most part, this panel errs more on the side of a Madisonian concept of foreign policy rather than a Hamiltonian concept. This was laid out in the Helvetus and Pacifist papers, with Hamilton taking the side of pacifist and arguing that George Washington did have the power to issue the Neutrality Proclamation due to inherent powers of the presidency, while we are more on the side of the Madisonian concept that the president might not have these powers because it would fall under the Article 1, Section 10 powers of Congress to declare war.
So, okay, I want to focus a little bit more on democracy and our need to spread it. How did the events, the insurrection on January 6th, help or hurt our efforts to promote democracy?
So when it came to the insurrection, it kind of made America seem a bit more unstable on a global stage. Other countries looked to America as an example. We're a global superpower. We're permanent members of the UN. We're part of NATO. And the United States' global influence and reputation really matters in terms of our diplomatic relations with other countries. That certainly made a dent in our diplomatic relations in trying to tell other countries to promote democracy when seemingly that may be a problem domestically.
And when we are trying to project stability and trying to project confidence on the global stage, it makes it very hard for us to lead by example when we don't have everything straight with our own democracy in our country. And I think that's one of the reasons which we ought to focus on that and making sure that we have confidence in our elections.
So if part of the issue, if I understand the panel, is that Congress has abdicated its role and the executive branch has stepped in to fill the void, how do we reclaim a better balance?
So I think one of the ways that we can reclaim that is by having Congress reclaim some of their role. In U.S. v. Curtis Wright, the Supreme Court decided that Congress can cede authority to the president in vast swaths of foreign policy, unlike domestic policy. That also means that they can likely take it back. And we ought to encourage that so that we have more stability with our foreign policy.
What would be the citizens' role in making Congress do that?
I think that the citizens' role is through their elections. That's the ultimate check that citizens have over their representatives. And I think if citizens want to see a more active Congress in terms of foreign policy, then they ought to elect members that will be more active in foreign policy.
Also educating the population on their candidate, specifically the presidential candidate, because presidents have a major role in foreign policy as laid out in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution. The president is essentially the chief diplomat of the United States. And a lot of constituents just simply aren't educated on America's foreign policy and the foreign policy of the president. That's a major issue that we have in current day.
Taking into consideration the insurrection being a very extreme example of protest and not civil disobedience, but protest historically, especially in the civil rights movement, has been used to create good change for the nation.
So what do you think, pending question, is the most pressing foreign policy challenge that we are facing?
I would say that climate change would be the most pressing foreign policy, because we, as a world, will be affected if the world were to cave in on itself, basically.
Emphasizing my colleague's point, climate change is certainly a major problem because it's an issue that affects Americans, but it's not something that America itself can fix alone. It's something that we're forced to work with other countries on, including countries that we may consider enemies. For example, the United States entered the Glasgow Climate Pact with China during COP26, and ultimately we worked with a country that we did not have the best relations with, but we had to put those issues aside.
I also think in the short term, we have a very pressing issue of COVID-19. For example, we have had this unfortunate change of venue, and that is likely climate change, something that really exceeds borders, and we have to look at foreign policy in terms of stuff like vaccine diplomacy and making sure that we can prevent spread of variants like Omicron.
Thank you very much.
Very good. There's so much we could talk about. We could talk all day, couldn't we? And we would if we could, but we can't. So, sorry. You guys did an excellent job. It's really wonderful to be here with you. And I liked that you took a nuanced approach to the question, that you somewhat agree to the question that is being asked. That, sometimes, we don't always have allies. It's a good way to kind of get out of answering the question, if you were. Because I think that is true in American history. I mean, we're always going to be very close to England or the UK, but that doesn't mean we always do what they want us to do. Same thing with France. But we always have a special place in our heart for them. So, and you had lots of great information in here and some things that other groups had not mentioned. I loved how you throw in Madison, Helvetica Pacific neutrality. Good one. That was good. Thank you.
Yeah, I read that too. And what I really appreciated, I think, that no other group has really talked about is this change. Sign on to the climate, new president would get out, new president would go back in, then Iran, nuclear treaty. I mean,
what are other countries thinking when they see this? That we're crazy.
But so that really made my heart smile on that one. I wish I had some constructive criticism.
I also think nobody mentioned Russia. Pushing our buttons, right? Yeah. So I was surprised I didn't hear more. That's another thing to be thinking about as a security interest.
And I think you all really were the first people to talk about the vaccine.
Yes. And the issue with China and the vaccine, that's.
So I thought you did an incredible job. Very poised, you knew your stuff, and you knew beyond your stuff. It was really very well presented. Responsiveness was good. I would love for the conversation to go on for a few more months. The thing that gives me great hope is seeing how much you all are engaged. Because when I was in high school, I don't think I got to your level of engagement until probably I was in my 30s. A little slow on the uptake, I guess. But the challenges are such, and the world is moving so fast, that you've got to be ready to hit the ground running. And you folks are preparing yourself for it, and I am grateful to you. My generation is not like you necessarily in the best position, but not necessarily in the worst position. But you do have some incredible challenges ahead, and I'm grateful to each of you for the work and preparation that you put into this. Wish you well as you continue.
You'll be great.
Yes. Thank you.
That's ever done. No.
You just got a 170.
I really want to.
Oh, we're still screaming.
No, I think we lost it. I heard
Fine.
five and
Oh my
six.
God. Yeah, but there was us.
Can you stop?
We're gonna go to Chipotle.
We got on lunch?
Oh, yeah. I don't know, I'm right in front of,